The hospital room was quiet except for the slow, steady beep of the monitor. A man lay on the bed, his skin pale, his body weak, and his eyes tired from the endless fight against his own failing liver. For months he had been living in and out of this sterile place, watching time pass like sand slipping through an hourglass. Each day felt like it could be his last, yet he refused to let go of hope. He had once been full of energy, working long hours to provide for his family, laughing loudly at family dinners, and coaching his kids in small backyard games. But that life felt far away now. His illness had taken nearly everything: his strength, his ability to eat without pain, even the simple joy of walking outside without feeling dizzy. Doctors had told him plainly, the only chance he had left was a liver transplant. Without it, the clock was ticking. His wife often sat by his side, holding his hand, forcing a smile even though her eyes were red from sleepless nights. She tried to stay strong for him and their children, but he could see the fear hidden behind her forced calm. He knew she was terrified of losing him, and in his weakest moments he was terrified too. The wait for a donor was like a cruel game of chance. Each day he checked his phone, hoping for the call that never seemed to come. Every time the phone rang, his heart jumped, only to fall again when it was just a wrong number or another concerned relative. People told him to keep faith, but the waiting room of hope was a hard place to live in. He thought about death more often than he wanted to admit. He wasn't scared for himself as much as he was for the ones he would leave behind. His children were still young, still needing guidance, still needing their father to be there for birthdays, graduations, and life's countless little moments. The thought of not being there for them broke him more than the illness ever could. Late at night, when the hospital hallways were quiet and the world outside was asleep, he often stared at the ceiling and prayed. He wasn't asking for miracles or wealth or fame. He was simply asking for more time. Time to see his kids grow. Time to repair old mistakes. Time to laugh with his wife without the shadow of sickness hanging over them. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. His body grew weaker, and sometimes he wondered if he was holding on for nothing. But deep inside, a flicker of hope remained, stubborn and unyielding. He told himself over and over that he couldn't give up. Maybe tomorrow would be the day the phone would ring with the news he had been waiting for. His doctors visited often, adjusting his medications, reminding him gently but firmly that things were serious. One doctor in particular spoke to him with both honesty and compassion. "You're strong," the doctor said, "but your body is reaching its limits. We're doing everything we can, but you must prepare yourself. Still, don't lose faith. Miracles happen in ways we cannot predict." The word miracle stayed with him. He clung to it like a lifeline. He imagined what it would feel like to wake up one morning with a new liver, to feel the strength slowly returning to his body, to be able to eat a full meal without nausea, to walk outside with his children without fearing he might collapse. He dreamed of those simple joys, and those dreams kept him alive as much as the medicine did. His family visited whenever they could. His kids tried to act cheerful, telling him stories about school, about their friends, about small everyday things. He listened closely, soaking in every word, because each moment with them felt precious. He laughed when they tried to make him smile, even when it hurt his body to laugh. And when they left, he would close his eyes and whisper a quiet promise to himself. "I will fight. I will not give up." There were nights when pain overwhelmed him, when even the strongest painkillers couldn't quiet the storm in his body. In those hours, he felt like surrendering, like letting go. But then he would think of his children's faces, his wife's unwavering support, and he found the strength to push through. He reminded himself that he was not fighting just for himself. He was fighting for them. Outside of the hospital, life continued as usual. The world moved on while he lay trapped between hope and despair. He sometimes felt forgotten, as if the world had placed him on pause while everyone else kept living. But whenever his friends or extended family came to visit, bringing stories from the outside world, he realized he was still part of it, still connected to life, even if only through the thin threads of conversation. One afternoon, as he lay resting, he overheard a nurse speaking softly about another patient who had received a transplant. The joy in her voice, the relief, the happiness, it filled him with both hope and envy. He wanted that to be his story too. He wanted to be the one waking up after surgery, thanking the heavens for another chance. He wanted to be the one telling his children that their father wasn't going anywhere. But the wait continued. Each passing day was a test of patience and faith. He knew that someone somewhere had to lose their life for him to gain his. That truth weighed heavily on his heart. He struggled with the idea that his chance at living depended on another family's tragedy. Sometimes he wondered if he even deserved it. But then his wife would remind him that organ donation was an act of love, a gift beyond measure, and that he should be ready to accept it with gratitude if the chance came. Through all the hardship, he never stopped believing, even when his body begged him to. The fight was far from over. His life was hanging by a thread, but he still dreamed of the day when the phone would finally ring, not with another false hope, but with the call that would give him the second chance he had been waiting for. And as another long night settled over the hospital, he whispered his nightly prayer once more, holding tightly to the hope that tomorrow might be different, that somewhere out there, fate was preparing to give him the miracle he so desperately needed. The night had been restless. He had tossed and turned in his hospital bed, unable to find comfort no matter how he shifted. His body felt heavy, his thoughts clouded, and his heart carried the same quiet fear it always did. What if this was his last night? What if tomorrow never came? He was half asleep when his phone rang on the bedside table. At first he thought it was another wrong number or maybe a family member checking in, but when he answered, he heard a voice that carried urgency and hope all at once. "We found a match." For a moment, he didn't understand. The words felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. The nurse on the other end repeated it slowly, making sure he heard it clearly. A donor liver had been located, and it was a strong match for him. His body froze. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. The moment he had dreamed of for months, maybe even years, had finally arrived. His wife, who had been dozing in the chair beside his bed, woke up when she saw his expression. At first she panicked, thinking something was wrong, but when he whispered the news, her eyes widened with disbelief. Then she cried, covering her face with her hands, whispering thank yous over and over again. The hospital staff rushed to prepare him for surgery. The room became a whirlwind of movement. Nurses checking his vitals, doctors explaining procedures, consent forms placed in front of him. He barely heard half of what they were saying. His heart was racing, not with fear this time, but with hope. He looked at his wife, then at the photo of his children taped on the wall near his bed, and silently promised himself that he would fight with every ounce of strength he had left. The hours leading up to the surgery felt like minutes. He was wheeled down the sterile hallways, bright lights passing above him one after another. He tried to stay calm, but his hands trembled as he gripped the thin blanket covering him. A nurse gently touched his shoulder and told him he would be all right. He wanted to believe her. Inside the operating room, the air felt cold and sharp. Machines beeped softly and the surgeons moved with quiet focus. Before the anesthesia took him under, he whispered a prayer, not just for himself but also for the unknown person whose liver was about to save his life. He didn't know who they were or how they had died, but he felt a deep gratitude and sorrow for them. Then the world went black. When he opened his eyes again, it was hours later. At first, everything was blurry. He couldn't tell where he was, only that his body felt strange. Lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Slowly, he realized he was still alive. The surgery had worked. The donor liver was inside him now, beating in rhythm with his body, giving him a second chance. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he turned his head and saw his wife sitting there, holding his hand tightly. She was crying too, whispering over and over, "You made it. You're still here." For the first time in a long time, his heart felt full of hope instead of fear. The next few days were difficult, but they were filled with something he had not felt in years: possibility. Every morning the doctors came to check on him, carefully monitoring his body's response. He could see the relief on their faces when they told him his body was accepting the new liver. It wasn't easy. He was sore, weak, and exhausted, but each small step forward felt like a victory. The first time he sat up in bed without help, he felt like he had conquered a mountain. The first time he stood on shaky legs, his wife clapped her hands with joy, as if he had just run a marathon. Even the simple act of sipping water without feeling pain brought him overwhelming gratitude. His children were allowed to visit a few days later. When they walked into the room, their eyes wide with worry, he greeted them with a smile. He had missed that feeling, the ability to smile without forcing it, without hiding his pain. His kids ran to his side, hugging him gently, afraid of hurting him. He laughed, a soft but real laugh, and told them, "Don't worry, your father's stronger than he looks." It felt as if the weight of months had been lifted off their shoulders. For so long they had lived with the constant fear of losing him. Now for the first time they saw hope written on his face. His wife, standing behind them, wiped away her tears quietly, letting them have this moment. But even in the middle of his joy, there was a quiet heaviness in his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about the donor. Who was the person who had given him this chance at life? What had happened to them? Did their family know that their loved one had saved a stranger? These questions lingered in his mind like shadows, even as his body slowly healed. He didn't speak of it right away, not wanting to spoil the happiness of his family. But late at night, when the room was quiet and he was alone with his thoughts, he whispered thank you to the unseen soul who had made this possible. He promised himself that one day when he was stronger, he would find out who they were. Recovery was slow, but it was steady. Weeks passed and he grew stronger each day. He was able to walk down the hospital corridor with the help of a cane, each step filled with determination. The doctors praised his progress, telling him he was on the right path. His wife never left his side, encouraging him with every milestone. One afternoon, as he sat by the hospital window, watching the world outside, he realized how much he had taken for granted before his illness. The sunlight, the sound of cars in the distance, the laughter of children playing on the street. These simple things felt extraordinary now. He had been given a second chance and he vowed not to waste it. When the day finally came for him to leave the hospital, his family surrounded him with love and joy. He walked out slowly, feeling the fresh air on his face for the first time in months. It was overwhelming, like stepping into a brand new world. The road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he believed in tomorrow. Still, beneath all the happiness, that quiet question remained. Who was his donor? What story lay behind the liver now keeping him alive? He didn't know yet, but he could feel that the answer would one day come to him. And when it did, it might change everything he thought he knew about his second chance at life. The days after leaving the hospital felt like stepping into a new world. Everything seemed brighter, sharper, and more precious than it had before. For months he had been confined to a hospital bed, staring at white walls and waiting for time to pass. Now he could walk outside, feel the sun on his face, and breathe in the fresh air without fear that it would be his last breath. At first, recovery was slow. He was careful with every step, mindful of the soreness in his body. He still had to visit the hospital regularly for checkups, and the doctors monitored him closely. But little by little he felt stronger. Food tasted better, his laughter came more easily, and sleep was no longer filled with constant pain. His family noticed the difference too. They looked at him with relief, as though they had been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. But in the middle of all this new happiness, there was something inside him he couldn't ignore, a question that returned every night before he fell asleep. Who was the person who had given him this gift? He owed his life to someone he had never met, someone whose story he didn't know. That thought filled him with gratitude, but also with a restlessness he couldn't explain. He mentioned it once to his wife as they sat together on the porch one evening. The sky was painted orange with sunset, and the air smelled of the rain that had fallen earlier. He spoke softly, almost afraid to break the peaceful silence. "I keep thinking about the donor," he said. "Who were they? What happened to them? I feel like I'm living because of their sacrifice, and I don't even know their name." His wife looked at him carefully, her expression gentle but firm. "Maybe it's best not to know," she said. "The doctors always tell us these things are confidential for a reason. Maybe the family wants privacy." He nodded, but deep down he couldn't let it go. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper. He felt connected to this unknown person in a way he couldn't describe. Their liver was now part of him. Their life in some way was continuing through his. How could he not want to know more? As the weeks passed, his curiosity only grew stronger. During his hospital visits, he asked the staff if they could tell him anything about the donor. Most of them gave him polite but firm answers. "We can't share that information." But one nurse, who had grown fond of him after seeing his long struggle, pulled him aside and whispered, "All I can tell you is that the donor was young, much younger than you." That single piece of information stayed with him. Young. It broke his heart to think that someone so young had lost their life, and yet that loss was the reason he was alive today. He carried the weight of that knowledge like a shadow, both grateful and mournful. He began to search for answers in his own way. At home, he spent long nights reading about organ donation, stories of families who had lost loved ones but chose to give life to others through the gift of organs. Each story touched him deeply, but it also made him feel a stronger pull toward his own donor. Who were they? Did their family know what a difference they had made in his life? One day, as he sat in the waiting room for another checkup, he overheard two staff members quietly talking about recent cases. They didn't mention names, but he caught a detail. A young man from the same city had died in an accident around the time he had received his transplant. His heart began to race. Could it be? Was this the person who had saved him? The thought haunted him. He couldn't stop wondering, so he decided to take a careful step forward. He reached out through the hospital's patient support program, writing a letter of gratitude to the donor's family. He didn't know if they would ever read it, but he poured his heart into it anyway. He wrote about how their loved one's gift had given him another chance at life, how he now had the strength to be with his family again, how every breath he took was because of them. He ended the letter with a promise that he would never waste this second chance. The letter was sent through the hospital, and for weeks, he waited. Some nights he convinced himself that the family wouldn't reply. Other nights he imagined what they might say if they did. Would they be angry? Sad? Comforted? He didn't know. But his heart ached for a connection. Finally, one afternoon he received a response. It was brief, written in careful handwriting, but it changed everything. The family thanked him for his letter. They told him that their son had indeed been the donor. He had been only 25 years old, full of life and dreams, when tragedy struck. They didn't give details, but they shared that he had registered as an organ donor years ago. It was just the kind of person he was, the letter said. Always thinking of others. The words shook him to his core. 25, so young. Younger than he had ever imagined. He sat in silence for a long time after reading the letter, the paper trembling in his hands. He couldn't stop the tears from falling. He had been given life, but it had come at the cost of a young man's future, a future that would never be lived. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. He felt both grateful and guilty. Grateful for the gift. Guilty that he was alive while someone else's child, someone else's brother, was gone. But in the middle of his guilt, a thought grew inside him. Maybe the best way to honor the donor's memory was not to drown in sorrow, but to live fully. To use this second chance wisely. Still, the connection he felt to the donor grew stronger. He wanted to know more, though he hesitated to ask. He worried about crossing a line, about hurting the grieving family by digging too deep. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story, something waiting to be uncovered. In the following weeks, as his strength returned and his days grew brighter, the shadow of that unanswered question lingered. Who exactly was this young man? What life had he lived before fate had brought their stories together? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that learning the truth wasn't just about curiosity. It was about understanding the gift he had been given. And so, even as he smiled more, walked further, and laughed louder, a quiet determination grew inside him. One day, he would uncover the story of his donor. And when he did, he knew it would change the way he saw not only his own life, but the very meaning of the second chance he had been given. The letter from the donor's family had brought him both peace and restlessness. Peace because he finally knew something about the person who had saved his life. Restlessness because the short note had left him with even more questions than answers. He read it over and over again, memorizing every word until the paper felt worn in his hands. The family had been kind, gentle, and respectful, but they had shared very little. Just the basics. Their son was young, caring, and generous. He had chosen to be an organ donor long before tragedy struck. But who had he really been? What kind of life had he lived? What were his dreams? What had he loved? What had made him laugh? These questions kept circling in his mind until they became impossible to ignore. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a pull, a strange bond to this young man. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about connection. At first, he tried to silence the urge. He told himself it was enough to simply be alive, enough to live well and carry the donor's memory quietly in his heart. But the thought of not knowing more felt unbearable, as if he were holding on to a story with missing pages. His wife noticed the way he would sit quietly at night staring at nothing, lost in thought. She asked him what was troubling him, and he admitted his feelings. "I know I shouldn't," he said softly. "But I need to understand more about him. He's part of me now. I can't just live without knowing who he really was." His wife hesitated. She was protective, cautious. "But what if it hurts the family? They're already grieving. Maybe they don't want to share more than they already did." "I know," he whispered, his voice heavy, "and I don't want to cause them pain. But if I do nothing, I'll always wonder, and wondering feels heavier than the truth no matter what it is." Eventually, with his wife's quiet support, he decided to write another letter. This time he was careful. He didn't ask for details directly. Instead, he shared more of his own journey, how the transplant had changed his life, how he was getting stronger, how he thought of their son every single day. At the end, he added just one line. "If there is anything more you would like me to know about him, I would be deeply honored." Weeks passed before an answer came, and when it did, it was longer than he expected. The family shared fragments of their son's life. He had been bright, hardworking, and full of laughter. He had been someone who always tried to help others even when it was inconvenient. The family described how he loved sports, how he had dreams of starting his own business, how he had been the kind of person people turned to when they needed support. But then came a detail that stopped his breath cold. The young man had grown up in the very same neighborhood he had once lived in years ago. Not only that, he had a name that was achingly familiar. His heart began to race as he read the letter again and again. He knew that name. He knew it because the donor was not a stranger at all. The donor was his nephew. The realization crashed over him like a wave. Memories rushed back of his brother's son, a boy he hadn't seen in years. The family had been torn apart long ago by bitter arguments and misunderstandings. Words had been said, walls had been built, and contact had been broken. He had lost touch with them, convinced that the wounds would never heal. And now here he was, living because of the boy who had once run through his brother's yard, laughing, chasing after a ball, calling him uncle with joy in his voice. He sat in silence for hours, the letter trembling in his hands. The weight of it was almost unbearable. His nephew, his own blood. The boy he had once known had grown into a man he barely recognized, and now that man had saved him in death. His chest tightened with both gratitude and grief. When he finally told his wife, she covered her mouth in shock. She too remembered the boy, remembered family gatherings long ago before the rift had pulled everyone apart. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "All these years, and you didn't know." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I didn't know, and now it's too late." But in that moment of sorrow, a new thought rose in him. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still something to be done. His nephew was gone, but his brother and his brother's family were still alive. Maybe this tragedy could be the bridge that brought them back together. The decision wasn't easy. He hadn't spoken to his brother in decades. Old wounds don't close easily, and pride often builds walls higher than forgiveness can climb. But he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. His life was tied to his nephew's sacrifice, and in that truth he found courage. He wrote again, this time directly to his brother. The words were some of the hardest he had ever put on paper. He apologized for the years of silence, for the mistakes, for the bitterness that had kept them apart. He spoke of his gratitude, of his sorrow, and of his desire to honor the memory of the young man who had brought them together again, in the most unexpected way. Days passed, then weeks, with no reply. Each time the mail arrived, he checked it with trembling hands, his heart heavy with both hope and fear. He told himself that maybe his brother would never answer, that maybe the wounds were still too deep. But one morning, a letter finally came. The handwriting was shaky, familiar, and filled with emotion. His brother wrote of his own grief, of the unbearable loss of his son, but also of the strange comfort in knowing that part of his boy was still alive through the gift of organ donation. And then came the line that broke through years of silence. "If you are willing, I would like us to meet." When he read those words, tears spilled down his cheeks. It was the opening he had been hoping for, the chance to mend what had been broken. His wife held his hand tightly, her own eyes wet with tears. "This is it," she whispered. "This is your chance." The days leading up to the meeting were filled with nervous anticipation. He replayed old memories in his mind, childhood moments with his brother, the last bitter arguments, the years of silence that had followed. He feared rejection, feared that old anger might rise again. But beneath the fear was hope, fragile but real. When the day finally came, he stood at the edge of his brother's driveway, his heart pounding. The house looked the same as he remembered, though older now, quieter, touched by both time and grief. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling, and knocked on the door. When it opened, there stood his brother, older, grayer, but unmistakably the same. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, eyes heavy with years of unspoken words. Then, without needing to say anything, his brother stepped forward and embraced him. It was an embrace filled with sorrow, forgiveness, and love. The years of silence melted away in that instant. Both men wept, holding on to each other as if letting go would mean losing everything all over again. In that moment, he realized the shocking truth wasn't just that his donor had been his nephew. The deeper truth was that the young man had given them more than life. He had given them a chance to heal, a chance to rebuild a family torn apart by pride. And as he stood there in his brother's arms, he knew that this second chance wasn't just his. It belonged to all of them. The first meeting with his brother had been heavy with emotions, but it was also the beginning of something new. For years, anger and pride had built a wall between them, but now, standing in his brother's house, sharing tears over the memory of the young man they had both loved in different ways, that wall began to crumble. They sat together in the living room, surrounded by framed photographs. His eyes were drawn to one picture in particular, a smiling young man full of life standing in front of a small graduation stage. It was the donor, his nephew, the boy he had once known, now frozen in time, never to grow older. His heart tightened as he realized how much of his nephew's life he had missed. The birthdays, the milestones, the laughter that had happened without him there. His brother noticed where his eyes lingered. He followed his gaze, then spoke softly. "He looked up to you once, you know. Even after everything that happened between us. He used to ask about you. He didn't understand why we stopped talking." The words pierced him deeper than he expected. He swallowed hard, guilt heavy in his chest. "I failed him," he whispered. "I failed both of you, and now the only reason I'm alive is because of him." His brother shook his head slowly. "You didn't fail him. Life is complicated. Families fight, people make mistakes, but if he were here, I know he'd be glad you're alive." That's who he was, always thinking of others. The two men sat in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. For years they had been strangers to each other, yet now they were bound together more closely than ever, not by blood alone, but by loss, by love, and by the gift of life. In the weeks that followed, they began to meet more often. At first it was cautious, small steps toward rebuilding what had been broken. They shared stories, laughed about old memories, and sometimes fell quiet when grief washed over them. Healing wasn't immediate, but it was happening. Slowly, painfully, but surely. One evening, he was invited to a family dinner at his brother's house. It felt strange at first, stepping into a home filled with reminders of the nephew who was gone. His brother's wife greeted him warmly, though her eyes carried both sadness and kindness. Around the table, the atmosphere was bittersweet. There was laughter, yes, but also pauses where someone's voice would break or a memory would bring tears. During that dinner, his brother's wife shared something that stayed with him. "He always said he wanted to make a difference," she said softly, her hands resting on the table. "He used to talk about how if he ever could, he'd want to save lives. We never thought it would happen like this. But in a way, he got what he wanted. Through you." The words sank deep into his heart. It was as though his nephew's dream had been fulfilled, even if in a way no one could have predicted. He promised himself silently and fiercely that he would live in a way that honored that dream. With time, the bond between the two families grew stronger. His children grew close to their cousins, filling the silence of lost years with new laughter and new memories. Holidays that had once been spent apart were now shared. The once broken family found itself whole again, though the empty chair of the nephew always reminded them of the price that had been paid. For him, life after the transplant became more than just survival. Every morning when he woke up, he touched his chest and whispered a quiet thank you. Every meal, every walk, every laugh with his family felt like a gift. He no longer rushed through life the way he once had. He noticed small things now. The way the sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, the way his children's laughter echoed down the hallway, the way his wife's hand felt in his after so many years of worry and fear. He began to volunteer at local hospitals, speaking to patients who were waiting for transplants. He would sit by their beds sharing his story, reminding them not to lose hope. "I know the waiting feels endless," he would tell them. "I know the fear. But miracles happen. Don't give up." His words carried weight because they came from experience, from a man who had been to the edge and returned. Whenever he spoke publicly about organ donation, he never failed to mention his gratitude. He didn't always share the full truth about who his donor had been, but he always spoke about the power of giving life to others. People listened, sometimes with tears in their eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice. But the most important change was the one inside him. He no longer carried the same anger or pride that once tore his family apart. Life was too short for grudges, too fragile for bitterness. The loss of his nephew had taught him that every day was precious, and that forgiveness was worth more than pride. Years later, on the anniversary of his nephew's passing, he stood with his brother and the rest of the family at the cemetery. The air was quiet, heavy with both sorrow and peace. He placed flowers on the grave, his hands trembling slightly. His brother stood beside him, silent but present. Together they remembered the young man whose life had been cut short and whose legacy lived on in a way none of them could have imagined. As he looked down at the headstone, he whispered softly, "Thank you. I promise I'll make this life count." And he meant it. The truth about his donor had shocked him, shaken him, and broken him open in ways he hadn't expected. But it had also given him something he thought he had lost forever: family, forgiveness, and a reason to live with purpose. His second chance was not just about surviving. It was about healing, loving, and carrying forward the memory of the one who had given him life in the most unexpected way. In the end, he realized that the gift he had received was not just a liver. It was a lesson about how fragile life is, how important family is, and how love can outlast even death. And as long as he lived, he would carry that lesson in his heart, honoring the nephew who had unknowingly given him the greatest gift of all, a chance to begin again.